My name is Meg Sheehan. I'm the coordinator of the North American Megadam Resistance Alliance. We're an alliance of individuals and groups whose mission is to protect rivers and their communities from megadams and their transmission corridors. We welcome everyone here tonight. We have new friends and old faces, and we're really excited that everyone has joined us. This is our 9th webinar, and we have a slide here with our 2 upcoming webinars. This is the first in a series. We'll be talking with Indigenous First Nations at our next webinar on April 3rd, and on Wednesday, May 5th, we'll be talking about the climate change impacts. So my topic tonight will be on updates both from the Indigenous opposition to Hydro-Quebec's activities and new regulatory developments and policy developments that we're involved in here in Massachusetts and New England. We have an action-packed webinar tonight, 3 really important things you can do to help us take action and make an impact and raise awareness about this issue. We'll be putting links for those activities in the chat box for you. I'll be giving an overview about importing Hydro-Quebec electricity from megadams in Eastern Canada to Boston via the corridors. There is a new corridor that's being constructed on the other side of the border in Canada to the Maine border that is facing a lot of opposition from Indigenous communities as well as others. And then there is, of course, the Central Maine Power CMP, or New England Clean Energy Connect corridor, that is continuing that line through Maine and to Boston. The distances from these dams can be up to 1,200 miles away from where the power is generated in remote areas of the subarctic, all the way down into Boston. I'm just going to pause for a minute because there seem to be a lot of people coming in. Okay, so our next slide is a great new map that was produced by one of our volunteers, Peter Howe. We're just unveiling this tonight, and it gives another perspective on Canadian hydropower. It shows the Indigenous territories in Eastern Canada where the dam facilities are located, and it also indicates where the Hydro-Quebec generating facilities, including transmission corridors, are located. So thanks very much to Peter for that, and we'll be putting it on our website if you'd like to study it a little bit closer. Our Alliance is committed to raising awareness about the environmental racism resulting from the Canadian government's hydropower. 36% of the electricity that Hydro-Quebec is selling to the United States does not belong to Hydro-Quebec, but it is from land. So electricity is from dams that are built without consent, or in the words of First Nations, Hydro-Quebec is a state-run extortion scheme. The dams have been, the lands have been occupied for millennia by thriving communities who lived hunting, fishing, trapping, and gathering. Many of these communities today still rely on wild foods for their physical and cultural survival. Over 100 years of hydropower development in Canada have destroyed hundreds of thousands of square miles and include reservoirs that cover, covering up to 2,000 square miles. Sorry. These dams have completely upended the ecological functioning of these river systems and are impacting ocean fisheries and the ability of the oceans to act as a carbon sink. You can see from the slides here that these are not small dams, these are mega dams. This is Hydro-Quebec's Manic 5 dam. And you can see on the right, the erosion and landslides caused by river manipulation. So this is an ongoing destruction, not just destruction that is caused by the initial construction of the dam. Regulatory loopholes and corporate greenwashing portray Canadian hydro as clean and green. Hydro-Quebec cannot deliver on the climate benefits that it claims that CMP will deliver. Our previous webinars covered the greenhouse gas emissions from Canadian hydropower in detail. They can be on par with fossil fuels. You can find that information on our website. Hydro-Quebec produces electricity for CMP and for its current imports from 63 massive installations across Quebec and Labrador. It cannot substantiate its claims of low emissions or even its claims of zero emissions, as it falsely claimed the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities in the regulatory proceeding on CMP. Hydro-Quebec does not have site-specific emissions data from its 63 generating stations. It exploits numerous regulatory loopholes that Massachusetts is ignoring and proceeding with CMP. The renewable hydro myth that is perpetuated by Hydro-Quebec and many policymakers is based on the childlike notion that because precipitation keeps falling from the sky, the electricity that is generated by these massive hydropower facilities is clean and green. The rivers, the ecosystems, and the communities that are being destroyed and continue to be destroyed by Hydro-Quebec's power generation are not renewable. There is new opposition within the last year from impacted communities. As you may know, NAMRA is part of the NECEC Alliance, which is an Indigenous-led network at the University of Manitoba. And it is documenting and supporting communities who are impacted by Canadian hydro across the country. So in Eastern Canada, this opposition is coming from a growing resistance consisting of a coalition of 5 First Nations on the north shore of the St. Lawrence River. You can check out their website at quebechahdroclash.ca. Some of these members will be appearing at our next webinar in April. And you may have read Lucien Wabinonek's op-ed. He is from Lac Simon, from the Council of the Anishinaabe on the north shore of the St. Lawrence River. And he talks about how this is not clean and green energy that is being exported from his community to the US, but that it has taken everything from his people. The Innu of Labrador launched a $4 billion lawsuit against Hydro-Quebec for cultural genocide and the taking of their lands for hydro production, and that is in connection with the Upper Churchill Dam in Labrador. Of course, NAMRA has been supporting the Labrador Land Protectors and the Grand River Keepers and opposing Muskrat Falls in Labrador, the mega dam there. We call these 3 dams the evil triplets, a term coined by Sarah Cox, who I see is on the call. We have the Site C mega dam in British Columbia, the Muskrat Falls Dam. Unfortunately, last week we learned devastating news that the government of British Columbia has decided to proceed with the Site C dam, even though it is built on unstable shale and over budget. We are standing in solidarity with the West Moberly First Nation, who has a legal challenge against Site C, and there are resources that you can use to check that out. So what NAMRA has been involved with recently in terms of policy and regulatory matters is looking at the ratepayer subsidies that are intended for green and clean energy that are driving the new dam construction in Canada. That includes the 3 that I just talked about and the Romaine dams in Quebec. All of these dams were built for electricity to be exported to the United States. Therefore, we are complicit as consumers in the environmental racism that is associated with these projects. In Massachusetts, we have the Decarbonization Roadmap that is now out for public comment. This is a plan to achieve long-term emission reduction goals within the Commonwealth. It's a planning document to identify cost-effective and equitable strategies to ensure that Massachusetts reduces greenhouse gas emissions by at least 85% by 2050 and achieves net zero emissions, whatever those are. The roadmap calls for several new high voltage transmission lines to Canada and New York that will allow sharing of low cost clean energy, including hydropower, with the Commonwealth's neighbors in the Northeast. This is language that is straight from the Hydro-Quebec playbook. The roadmap claims that this will result in ultra low emissions for the electricity grid. It calls for continued imports and more corridors. We want to know who is paying for this low cost electricity, low cost for whom? Is this really clean energy, and is it really going to achieve our climate goals? We believe not. The decarbonization roadmap itself is full of techno jargon. I challenge anyone to read it and understand what it means. And it's quite a sharp contrast to the plain and powerful words of Lucien Wabanonik in his op-ed from Loximon about the very real and concrete impacts that the production of this hydropower has on his community. Although the roadmap claims that it will result in significant improvements in air quality and health benefits to overburdened environmental justice populations and communities of color, quote unquote, it doesn't say how it will address cultural genocide and environmental racism in Canada associated with the plan. Apparently, for Governor Baker, climate justice stops at the Canadian border. The decarbonization roadmap refers to abundant hydropower available from the region, including Quebec and New Brunswick. Notably absent from the roadmap are the words Indigenous, river, fish, and ecology. How can we have a climate plan that destroys communities, rivers, and ecology? The other policy area that we're involved in is with the Independent Service Operators of New England. Who are they? I will call them ISO. They basically run our electricity grid, do the planning, determine who gets to sell what and for how much. One of the things that they do is produce an annual report on air emissions produced by the electricity sector in New England. And one of the major flaws in that is that Hydro-Quebec's imports are counted as zero emissions. So we believe there's a climate crisis. We believe that there is no time to play shell games with greenhouse gases from Hydro-Quebec's electricity, and there's should be no tolerance for letting ISO avoid this issue any longer and report to us, as they have, that they can't get any numbers out of Quebec and that Hydro-Quebec will not tell them the direct emissions from their generating stations. So that leads us to our take actions. We have 2 take actions. We'll put the links in the chat so you can take action right away, or copy the link. It will be on our Facebook page. And our first take action is to ask Governor Baker to remove Canadian hydropower and new corridors from the decarbonization roadmap. You can click and send a letter. And our second take action is to ask ISO New England to revise its greenhouse gas reporting to account for greenhouse gas emissions from Canadian hydropower, so we can have transparency and accountability and know what the real impact of our electricity usage is. Thank you. And I'll turn it over to Kevin Cassidy, our next speaker.
Thanks, Meg. Thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. My name's Kevin Cassidy. I'm an environmental attorney with Earthrise Law Center, which is the environmental legal clinic of Lewis and Clark Law School. And I'm primarily going to talk about some of the ongoing litigation involving the Army Corps and their environmental review of the CMP transmission line. Some of it, there'll be a little bit of overlap with what Meg talked about, but I don't think too much. So let me jump right in. Here's a little map that we've already seen, this transmission line is supposed to run from the Canadian border down to Lewiston, where it hooks into the grid. It's about 145 miles long to get to Lewiston. There's another spur of it, separate spur, that's about 25 miles or so, and 53 miles of that is brand new corridor coming through the Western Maine mountains that they're going to cut. It's the precursor to this line was something called the Northern Pass transmission line over in New Hampshire. And that was rejected by state regulators in New Hampshire. And so this became Plan B for Hydro-Quebec to get the electricity down to Massachusetts. There's also a similar line called the Vermont Clean Power Link that is underground or underwater and fully permitted. Those just put a pin in those two. They'll become a little more relevant later as part of our litigation. But there were these other alternatives potentially for this line prior to CMP's transmission line. The CMP line, they originally applied back in 2017. They need a couple of federal permits to operate. One is a presidential permit from the Department of Energy because they're crossing the international border of Canada and the United States. They also need a Clean Water Act and Rivers and Harbors Act permit from the Army Corps of Engineers because they're impacting wetlands along the transmission route. This line is cutting through critical habitat for multiple federally listed endangered and threatened species like Atlantic salmon and Canada lynx. So they had to consult with Fish and Wildlife Service, and there were actually some other consultations with other federal agencies related to historic properties and rerouting of the Appalachian Trail, and they talked to the National Park Service about that. The Army Corps gave them, and this photo kind of just is a photo simulation. I should have said at the outset, I borrowed some of these slides from the Natural Resources Council of Maine, which is one of my clients in the litigation, along with Sierra Club and Appalachian Mountain Club. And this is a photo simulation that shows where the line is going to run in part of that 53 miles of newly cut corridor. Folks from Maine can probably tell what mountain this is a view from the top of. I won't say because I'm not sure, but needless to say, it's going to really impact the recreation, the scenic views, and the aesthetic experiences of people going and hiking and backpacking, snowmobiling, fishing, hunting, all of those activities that folks like to do in that area. The Army Corps, they had to, actually, Julian, before we go to this slide, thanks. As part of getting their Clean Water Act and Rivers and Harbors Act permit, the Army Corps had to do an environmental evaluation under NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. And they completed that evaluation back in July 7th of 2020. When you do a NEPA evaluation, you can kind of go in one or two directions. If you do an environmental assessment, that is supposed to tell you whether you should do more evaluation in what's called an environmental impact statement. Or if you decide you don't need to do any more because there's not going to be a significant impact on the environment, federal agencies come up with what's called a finding of no significant impact, or a FONSI. for short. And so the Corps did an environmental assessment and sort of incredibly decided that there was going to be no significant impact from this project, and issued its FONSI back in July. It didn't release that document to the public. It signed it, it finalized it. As far as I know, it's still honestly not up on its website. We needed to do a FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act request to get it, and we didn't get it until September. So once they finalize that, then they move on to the permitting. And I mentioned those two earlier projects. The reason that this was unusual for the Corps to do an environmental assessment and a FONSI, a finding of no significant impact here, is because for the Northern Pass, the federal government did an EIS, which is a much more robust environmental analysis. It also involves more public participation. The public has more opportunities to comment on the Corps' analysis. So for the Northern Pass, they did an environmental impact statement. For the Vermont Clean Energy Link, the federal government did an environmental impact statement. And even if you go back to the mid 90s here in Maine, there was a project called the Bangor Hydro Line, which also crossed the border in northern Maine. And that also had an environmental impact statement done for it. So the Corps' decision to only do an environmental assessment here and come up with a finding of no significant impact was a real departure from other projects of this type. So I guess we can move on. There were a lot of issues with the Corps' environmental evaluation that led to Sierra Club, Natural Resources Council of Maine, and Appalachian Mountain Club to file a lawsuit in federal court at the end of October, challenging that decision. And just to give you a quick status report on that case, it's actually a lot has happened since then. We heard that CMP was getting ready to do construction and start cutting down the trees in that first segment, that first 53 miles. They call it segment 1 from the border, the first 53 miles of the line. Obviously, once those trees, and this is a 300-foot right of way. And then the southern 150 feet of that are being used for the corridor. The other 150 feet are just there. Presumably they could be used in the future for for expanding the transmission line down the road. Once those trees come down, obviously they're not coming back in our lifetime. These are some areas have stands of trees that are 80, 100 years old. It is a managed forest, but there's no clear cutting that's taken place, and it's largely unfragmented, which makes it a really globally significant area for native species and unfragmented and undeveloped habitat. So we filed the lawsuit in the district court in Maine because we knew that the construction and cutting was going to occur. We asked the court for a preliminary injunction to stop that while the case was going on. The court in Maine denied our request. Again, we knew CMP was getting ready to move forward, so we appealed that on an emergency basis to the First Circuit Court of Appeals in Boston. That was occurring, in early January. And in the meantime, I mentioned the other permit that this project needs, which is the presidential permit. The Department of Energy had committed back in November of 2019 to Senator Collins in Maine that they were going to release their environmental analysis for public comment for 30 days. They had not done that yet, so the CMP did not have their presidential permit, and our argument was they shouldn't have been going forward without that. Well, right at the end of the last administration, the Department of Energy, without releasing their environmental analysis for public comment, went ahead and also made a finding of no significant impact and issued the presidential permit. And that occurred about 4 or 5 days before the administration changed. So that was January 4th, or actually it was about January 14th. I remember the date because the next day, CMP had started construction work and clearing some roads to go in and start cutting the trees. And that was the 15th of January. That same day, the First Circuit Court of Appeals granted an injunction pending the appeal of the case. And so that stopped the trees from coming down in that segment one. And that injunction is still pending. We've now briefed the case before the First Circuit Court of Appeals, and we're going to have oral argument on it toward the end of this month. So that's the status of the case. As I said, there are a lot of issues with the Corps' analysis, also a lot of issues with DOE's analysis, including the fragmentation, the impacts to native brook trout, the impacts to deer wintering areas along the corridor, the impacts to recreation and tourism in the area. But one of the issues that we're talking about tonight is the greenhouse gas impacts. And we have up here, as Meg said, Hydro-Quebec has never provided any data to show that there are going to be, why these supposed greenhouse gas reductions are going to occur. Here's a statement from one of CMP's attorneys to DEP that says, nowhere has CMP stated that the project's purpose and need includes greenhouse gas emissions reductions. The Corps may find that interesting because in the environmental assessment that they did under the purpose and need statement for the project, they listed that there would be clean energy delivered by the project that would improve system reliability and provide renewable energy to help Massachusetts meet its greenhouse gas emissions reductions goals. So it seems the Corps believes that part of the project's purpose and need is to have greenhouse gas emissions reductions in the region. You can go to the next slide, Julian. As Meg said, this isn't carbon-free energy. There's various data showing that there's emissions from these dams that are equal to natural gas plants, especially when they're first built and the reservoirs are flooded. Eventually, over time, those decrease, but this certainly isn't carbon-free energy and needs to be accounted for, especially here in Massachusetts. So go ahead to the next slide, Julian. This is when this contract was signed, here in Massachusetts with Hydro-Quebec for this energy to be delivered. The Massachusetts Attorney General, Maura Healey, challenged certain portions of the contract because in her view, in her office's view, that it would allow, there wouldn't be the greenhouse gas reductions that people were claiming, and that you would effectively be, playing the shell game, as Meg said, or arbitrage. It's also known as, where you're shifting the energy from one area to another. So, you're substituting this fossil fuel generation from other areas when you move the hydropower down to Massachusetts. And at the end of the day, there's no material decrease in greenhouse gases. Here in Massachusetts, as Meg said, they're not counting. They're not accounting for these emissions, and therefore they're not really capturing the full effect of what these dams are doing up in Canada. And of course, greenhouse gas emissions don't recognize state or international borders. Go ahead to the next slide. There were studies that were about this that were contracted by some of the vested interests, Hydro-Quebec, and even some from the environmental groups. And one of the things that folks in Maine looked for was an independent study of the CO2 impacts from this project. It was overwhelmingly approved in the Senate. There was a lot of lobbying that took place. It still was approved in the House, but it needed a 2/3 vote, and it didn't get it. So that was an attempt by folks in Maine to get a better handle on what the real greenhouse gas emissions impacts are. That didn't make it through the legislature, unfortunately. Go ahead to the next slide. And again, this is just another, slide of Maura Healey again saying that we just don't know. And unfortunately, the Attorney General's challenge to the contract in the Public Utilities Commission venue didn't succeed, and it wasn't appealed. So there's still a lack of data and a lack of information. One of the things, you could go to the next slide, Julian. One of the things that and I'll just end with this, in the Corps and DOE's analyses, environmental analyses, the Corps said in their document, they say DOE did an independent report about, on the greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, when the Corps came out with their analysis, DOE had not come out with their analysis yet, so we didn't know what DOE had done or hadn't done. When DOE finally issued its permit in January and they finalized their analysis, we saw the report, and it was essentially DOE looking at 3 or 4 studies that had been done. And I'll just read the conclusion of the report, and this is about whether or not greenhouse gas emission reductions are going to occur. DOE concluded that although the text of the reports that they looked at suggests that the sources and data on greenhouse gas formation may be reasonable, the reports do not provide sufficient supporting information that allow the consultant to make any conclusive statement. So again, they don't know, DOE doesn't know, the Corps doesn't know, nobody knows. There has been no real study of this, which is one of the criteria for doing an EIS, is to if there is uncertainty. And there's certainly a lot of uncertainty around the greenhouse gas impacts of this project that still remains. So I'll stop there, I think, and turn it over. I'm not sure who's going next, but thank you.
This will be welcome to Greg from the Sierra Club of Canada Foundation.
Great. Thanks for having me, folks. Yeah, great presentation so far. I'm learning a lot from what's happening down south of the border. Yeah, before beginning, I just wanted to acknowledge that I am presenting in Chubuktuk. That's on unceded Mi'kmaq territory, also known as Halifax, Nova Scotia. So in Atlantic Canada, and I'm going to be talking about the Atlantic Loop, and in particularly the 2 projects involved there. There's the Muskrat Falls project and the Gull Island project that hasn't kicked off yet, but has somewhat of a green light, but I think we could put a stop to it. This is happening on the Chebo River, so that's in the Grand River in Labrador, also known as Churchill River. Next slide, please, Julian. Yes, there's a little background on Sierra Club Foundation and the Atlantic Chapter. We just, our campaign is quite new. We just launched it in November of last year. And we're really, we're not just focusing, on mega dams and trying to get them to stop, but that same narrative is being applied to a bunch of other quote unquote, clean energy sources, be it biomass, natural gas, nuclear, green hydrogen is okay, but to get there, it needs to go through blue hydrogen, and that's a whole other kerfuffle. So, renewable now, let's break down a lot of these barriers when we're talking about renewable energy and really focus on, the definition and relaying that to the general public. So to do that, we really want to offer an amplifying voice. So, talking to the Innu in Labrador and in Northern Quebec, where these mega dams are being developed, and really amplifying their voice, amplifying the voice of people living in energy poverty. So people in Newfoundland who are going to be paying higher electricity bills because the $6 billion of over debt ultimately is going to trickle down to the ratepayer there. So talking to people who have 3 jobs, 2 kids, and are a single parent, trying to feed their family and or heat their homes in northern Newfoundland. Those ratepayers should have a voice, but they are largely going unheard because of the regime, the systemic regime that we're in. I'm Greg Gupko. I am one person, bounced around a lot. I'm in Halifax right now, originally from northwestern Quebec, spent many years in Toronto, Montreal, many different twists and turns in my career path, most recently working on a capitalization strategy for a small town here in Nova Scotia that, again, is focusing on energy poverty and the clean energy transition, but are just running into a ton of hurdles that we'll touch upon in next slides, because it does, the same hurdles exist for, to put a stop to these mega dams, to put a stop to nuclear in New Brunswick. And we're trying to build out that narrative to make it digestible for the general public. Many twists and turns in my career, obviously, working as a residential cleaner, working as environmental lab technician, community investment manager. So it's interesting to get, to see the world from these different perspectives, and different livelihoods. And people just don't have time necessarily to comment on climate change and on mega dams, but they have great ideas. So next slide, please. Quickly going through the agenda, I'm going to talk about what's happening here in Atlantic Canada, why it's a problem, what a potential solution is, and really how to make it relevant. So again, making it accessible for the general public, because they're ultimately, the gatekeepers sure is the legislation and is the the powers that be, but how do we make those gatekeepers turn the keys, because it's not really accessible as it stands. Next slide, please. So just quickly going over the Canadian landscape, a lot of you are probably familiar with this, but there are 4 different, energy solutions being touted in 4 different provinces, and, solutions in quotation marks, because they're not really solutions. In Nova Scotia, we're very reliant on coal, and it looks like, or the way it's being framed right now is that there is going to be an interim transition to natural gas and importing from Hydro-Quebec and Muskrat Falls, and we'll talk about that Atlantic loop in a second. And I think there is a place for connectivity. Like, we as Nova Scotians, should be able to receive firm capacity from renewable energy sources and should be able to get off coal, immediately. So there is some, interconnectivity, I think, is important, but we should also be focusing on, the local DER solutions that exist and that create local employment, et cetera. So I think there's room for both, and definitely no room for the mega dams that are happening in Newfoundland, right? So I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. They're heavily reliant on hydro. New Brunswick has been very focused on nuclear and is transitioning to more nuclear, just under a different title called solar module reactors, and they're trying to label them as clean. So there's a lot of, I think, similarities between all of these greenwashed solutions, including mega dams. And I think it's just been really important to get that across to the general public that these solutions really aren't green. I'll leave PI out of the picture. I won't target them because I think they're doing an okay job. I think they're transitioning to wind. Next slide, please, Julian. Yeah, so what's happening in Atlantic Canada continued. Yeah, there's a lot of utility competition and friction. I'm gonna throw Hydro-Quebec obviously into the mix because their name has been brought up a lot of time. It's especially here in Nova Scotia, it's a political and corporate chess game with a lot of these players, and it's really inaccessible to the general public. I'll talk about this integrated resource plan, this IRP that our utility was touting as being the most stakeholder friendly initiative ever to happen in worldwide or whatever, but really it's inaccessible to the general public, right? And we need to talk about that. So they're, going back in history, what's actually happening in Atlantic Canada? Well, in 2010, Muskrat Falls and Gull Island projects were announced through a partnership with Nalcor and Emera. So those are the parent company of the Nova Scotia utility, Nova Scotia Power, and Nalcor is essentially the utility in Newfoundland and Labrador. Phase one of the project, which is Muskrat Falls, it's broken down into two phases. Phase one is ongoing, almost at completion, 4 years later, and $6 billion over budget. And ultimately, again, ratepayers are going to have to pay for that $6 billion. Not Nova Scotia ratepayers, but Newfoundland and Labrador ratepayers, unfortunately, for them. So it's, we need to build that into our campaign narratives. And hopefully because of the over budget, the delays, and just the pushback from the various Indigenous communities and Inuit communities, hopefully phase two will not proceed. And I think we can gather enough support to put a stop to that. There was an inquiry, as you folks probably are aware, and I think it's important to highlight that the proponents unreasonably dismissed other options. So they selected these mega dams as the lowest cost options, but the inquiry suggests that that's not what happened. So I think it's really important to bring that into light. Like these hydro companies are just doing these massive hydro projects and are not actually looking at the lowest cost options. They're not looking at, at budgets and what ratepayers would need to pay for these massive projects. There are cheaper solutions. So next slide, please. So what's up with the Atlantic Loop? So the Atlantic Loop builds on, this Muskrat Falls and this Gull Island projects. So these two mega dams in Labrador. And the way it's framed, and it was framed in this 2019-2020 Atlantic Canada Roadmap, which suggests that it is a superhighway connecting existing and new power supplies across the region. So essentially, it exists to help get Nova Scotia off coal, to help get New Brunswick off coal. But ultimately, it's again a political game where we think, and we're hearing through the grapevine that ultimately people, they want to sell it to the states, they want to compete against Hydro-Quebec because they are competing utilities. So it's really interesting once we start pulling back these layers of just deceit. So I'll leave it at that for that. But the Maritime Link is complete. It's been complete for a number of years. It's a multi-billion-dollar kind of project that connects Newfoundland to Nova Scotia. But what would have happened if we invested that, in 2017, invested that money, billions of dollars into, again, battery storage, and became industry leaders in these, storage technologies that need to be adopted provincially to really make this transition happen. In 2021, the state of Maine, so the Governor's General Office, showed interest in reaching out to the Atlantic provinces. And I just know that, the Atlantic provinces, the utilities and the, some of the politicians are probably licking their chops just knowing and so excited to build some of that into their narrative. So I think it's really important to be working with you folks, south of the border to unify and come together and figure out how do we put an end to this ridiculous kerfuffle that's happening. Next slide, please. Just specifically here in Nova Scotia, because it is my backyard currently, I did speak about the integrated resource plan that's, very inaccessible to the general public. And there is a heavy focus on importing. They really concluded that, as a next step, they're putting all their bucks in this Atlantic loop and on these projects. Specifically Muskrat Falls, Gull Island is kind of iffy. Even our new premier, who was just brought into office in this year, recently in 2021, came on and suggested that, we as a province will reach 80% renewables by 2030, which is great that he, came out immediately and is suggesting that is possible. I think we can do a little bit better. And does that 80% include megadams? Does it include phase 2 of this Churchill project, right? Does it include the Gull Islands? Nobody knows. So I think that's important to uncover, and the devil's really in the details here, right? And that's kind of what we're trying to do, is highlight those details. So next slide, please. So I won't go into too much detail on obviously the environmental degradation that these megadams cause, because we're all quite familiar, I think, with it. But the Macheta-Jabo River, or where these Muskrat Falls and Gull Island projects are happening, there's a ton of environmental and racist, actually, I'm going to call out environmental racism here, that's happening with these projects. And how did it happen? Well, it's a lot of greed. And who let it happen? Maybe most important, I think, us as activists are somewhat to blame for not really being able to portray, the environmental racism that exists, the environmental damage that these mega dams are causing to the general public. I know we're up against these multi-billion-dollar corporations who are very, very good at greenwashing, and colonial governments who pretend to be reconciling decades of Indigenous genocide. But it'll be challenging, and continue to be challenging, since we are up against these giants. And that's why I think it's so important. And I just want to stress the fact that it's really important to get the general public and the public on side. So the residential cleaners of this world, the dog walkers of this world, the hairdressers, the tattoo artists, these type of people who, all show a ton of interest in sustainable lifestyles, but just aren't able to provide their voice on the right platforms. And, obviously it's easier said than done. I don't know what the solution is. I'm just stating the facts. Next slide, please. So I'll just run through this quickly. The problem, I think, is obvious to us, but we're kind of part of the problem. Just reiterating, that narrative that we're working on our little silos. And I think that previous presentations had actually brought this up too, that we kind of have to break down some of these silos that exist, between provinces, between countries, between communities, but also, between, different technologies. There's a lot of similarities between the nuclear war that's happening in New Brunswick and the mega dams that are happening in Labrador. So we as activists need to kind of rethink our approach. Are we too siloed, too exclusive? And the answers are probably yes and yes. So how do we get, the retail workers on board and get their voices kind of heard? Next slide, please. So this is kind of obvious, so I won't really dwell on this too much, but it's mass mobilization now. That's kind of the solution that we need. And I think it's really important to build that just transition lens into, and apply that lens to the great work that we're doing. Environmental racism is racism. It does exist here in Canada. It does exist down, south of the border, and especially with these mega dam projects, right? The Innu lives and livelihoods that are just endangered because of these billion-dollar corporations and this greed. So we need to bring that kind of front and center. And I think, there's a number of great organizations doing great work trying to highlight that. And I think it's important that we all, put that and apply that lens, put it front and center on in our campaigns, as well as, those in energy poverty or those that are marginalized. And, how do we get them involved in this clean energy transition? And away from mega dams and away from nuclear and onto, cleaner and greener practices and technologies and efficiency programs, et cetera. So yeah, I'll leave it at that for this slide. Next slide, please. These are just some examples of the mobilizing that's happening here in our backyard in Nova Scotia. So, there's some great activities coming together. The forest protectors stopping biomass projects in Nova Scotia. So biomass is something that we're kind of fighting tooth and nail here in Nova Scotia. And there's a lot of similarities to mega dams, right? In that it's portrayed as being clean, but that definition needs to change. The river protectors, so the grandmothers at Shubenacadie River. I was just on a call where an elder was presenting, and he's surprised by the lack of support from non-Indigenous people on these issues, and I think that's important too. Like, I think we as non-Indigenous people need to kind of step up and acknowledge that we're part of the problem. And find allies and work with our partners here. And I just wanted to highlight a big win in Quebec recently. I'm not sure if you folks heard of this, but big win for the Innu. They were able to get Magpie River, granted some rights. And that, I think, is the first of its kind in Canada. So how can we build off that? And, in my honest opinion, I think, I think all of nature should have these rights applied to them, and they should only be taken away with public consultation. It's too bad it's going the other way around, but at least I think this is a start. Next slide, please. I won't go through this in too much detail, but we need to do a better job at making it relevant and fun for the general public. Again, our province has now committed to 80% renewables. But what does that mean? Like, how do we get that definition changed? How do we demonstrate that, that definition needs to change the general public? Net zero by 2050, we know that's not good enough, especially as a quote unquote developed country. Like, we need to be paving the way for renewables, and not fake renewables, not, mega dams, et cetera. So let's stop pretending we're doing enough. And that's, a simple message. The Atlantic Loop, again, I think interconnectivity does have a place, but not with mega dams being developed, and that's not the solution. So, even just reframing, some of your campaigns. I was working on a project in Toronto with the Toronto Zoo, actually, and they're working on a biogas project that uses the animal waste and generates electricity from it. So they're, the organization Zoo Share launched this campaign called, like Poo Power or Poo Power People was their kind of logo, and their community bonds just sold right away because it was so catchy, and people were interested in what the hell are they talking about. So let's make it resonate with the general public. And again, the integrated resource plan that recently happened in Nova Scotia is just a failed, it's not accessible to the general public, and doesn't address the climate emergency. Next slide, please. So I won't go through these in detail because I think I'm running out of time here, but we do need to offer, solutions. And I think, even the first solution, right? Local ownership over P3s. General public don't know what P3s are, why they're bad, and why, local ownership and perhaps, cooperative ownership has a much better chance of being on budget, on time, has a much better chance of creating local jobs and empowering those in living in energy poverty, et cetera. So we need to build some of that into the narrative instead of just dropping, local ownership over P3s. Resource management over new developments, efficiency over expansion. And again, just want to, highlight the great work that's happening in the town of Bridgewater in Nova Scotia. A small town of 8,000 people, a really ambitious team, but they're just running into, they're running into a wall when it comes to the broader utility and political systems. And I think that's really important that, there's are these little pockets of great, these great folks that are trying to do amazing things for their communities, but they're running into these broader political barriers. So we need to really address those political barriers. We talked, I know in the previous slide, in previous presentations, we talked a little bit about the life cycle of carbon and how that's not accounted in mega dams. That's important. And, applying a wealth tax to really make renewables, real renewables, not mega dams, more attractive to kind of investors and developers rather. Next slide, please. Just wrapping it up here, framework relevancy, putting things into perspective. Again, the Muskrat Falls project, the hydro dam in Labrador, $6 billion over budget. Don't check me on my math here, but my back of the envelope calculation, so that might be 4 million homes a year, and that's just on what was over budget, right? Like what happened if we actually invested that money properly into like all of the money that went into the development into real renewables and real solutions and efficiency programs, etc. Like I don't know how many homes we could have retrofitted and brought to a net zero standard, but presumably quite a bit. If not all of Nova Scotia. So next slide, please. So in conclusion, obviously a paradigm shift is required on all fronts. I'm preaching to the choir here, but I think it's important to really apply the anti-racism and energy poverty lens to our campaigns as we're moving forward. Not only will it support the great work that these great organizations are already doing, but we have to admit that environmental racism exists and is just as big as an issue as and is maybe even a bigger issue because it's so hidden behind these political walls, etc. So I think we need to bring that front and center, and we are moving in the right direction. So I'm impressed with what we've done, but there's still obviously a lot more to do, and I think that really comes through with the messaging and working with one another, breaking down those silos. Next slide, please. And yeah, finally, that's my contact information. So feel free to reach out if you want to talk about, community financing is kind of my forte. Energy poverty and getting people out of energy poverty is kind of my forte. I'm less of an expert on mega dams, but I'm very interested in kind of learning more and how it impacts the communities, etc. And I'm a big proponent of all of your work. Also, just want to shout out if anyone's suffering from any mental health issues. I think there's still a lot of stigma around that. So feel free to reach out to me if you're going through some tough COVID-19 related times, because we've all been there. And yeah, that sums it up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Greg and Kevin. Really informative presentation. We do have a Google Drive with reference materials and reports and things. The link is there. We have a little bit of trouble here with our hyperlinks, but we can put those on our Facebook pages later. And we have time for Q&A. Here's the button down at the bottom of your screen that has reactions. You can raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question of any of the speakers, or feel free to shout out. We're a formal group and we'd love to hear your ideas. Any questions for any of our speakers?
Question. Hello, this is Anne.
Annie had a question.
Yeah. Hello, everybody, and thank you for your very interesting presentations. And my question is going to Greg regarding the trends in Canada. And what do you think is going to develop on the dismantling the dams in the near future as other forms of, well, say, more sustainable renewable energy are developed? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Unfortunately, I don't have a firm answer on that. I think it's a good sign that Hydro-Quebec recently came out and is suggesting that they're not developing anymore mega dams. I think we just need to really, as advocates, highlight and showcase the environmental degradation. Like they're not sustainable renewable resources, right? They're actually taking away a resource. So how can we claim to be renewable? So, I think we need to work on redefining the term renewable. And there's some very, very great groups that are currently working on how can we change those definitions? It doesn't just apply for mega dams. And I think that's maybe the first step in starting to dismantle these projects as renewables, real renewables, take their place. I think it's going to take a lot of work, and I think I think the first step is really to get that definition sorted out. And I'm actually working with the Department of Energy and Mines here in Nova Scotia to try figuring out how to change that definition. So we'll see.
Very interesting point. There really is there's certainly no federal definition here in the US of the term renewable energy. Different states have different definitions, and certainly there's no definition of clean, sustainable, or green. So it's whatever the proponent wants to call itself. Question here from Becky, is Hydro-Quebec going to build Romaine 5? That's the Romaine 5 dam on the Romaine River. Greg, do you know that answer to that question?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that question.
Someone has a question here. What is the current megadam cost per watt? I wish some of our folks from Labrador were on the call, because I know they have a lot of information about the costs. Is there anyone who could answer that question? Okay.
Trying to look through the answer now. No, I can't come up with it.
We have someone with their hand up.
Oops, I see. Okay, Cliff.
Yes. We need to use different language when we refer to any energy industry that fits the fossil fuel model. We really have to use criminal enterprise, because it's really easy to relate that, because the criminals are killing the planet and they're just going ahead and they don't care. And we got to use the right, when we talk about fossil fuel, we got to really get a little more hardcore. And I think that's part of our issue. We're all very soft and we're always on the defensive, but we really got to use the language. If you use enough language long enough, people will begin to believe it. And we just went through a former president who did that model and it worked. We got to use the word criminal in what we talk about when we talk about that. That's just a suggestion.
Okay, thank you. There's a question about methane and dams, and I believe Dr. Hager is on the call. Would you like to jump in and talk to us about that, Dr. Hager? Okay. Maybe he dropped off. There are a number of studies out there about methane, as Kevin mentioned. The methane emissions from hydropower reservoirs are the major source, and the flooding of forests in the first few years causes the biggest pulse of emissions of methane into the atmosphere. One of the big issues with a lot of the studies that have come out, and I keep going back to a study in 2019 by Dr. Hamburg from Environmental Defense Fund. You can find it online, but it is about the emissions of hydropower over time. It's a global synthesis that looks at all of the studies that have attempted to measure the greenhouse gas impacts of hydropower. And one of the major problems with all of these studies is that they look at the emissions over a 100 to 200 year time frame. And when we're talking about making policy decisions, as in Massachusetts, about reducing emissions by 2050 or 2030, that time frame and those studies are totally irrelevant. So what we really need to be looking at is that shorter time frame. For example, they just built the Romaine dams in Canada. They're smaller dams in comparison to a lot of the larger ones that have flooded, say, 20,000 square miles of boreal forest. But there was a sudden pulse of emissions from the flooding of the reservoir for the reservoirs for Romaine dams. And so if you were to apply those emissions in the short time frame, what are those numbers as they relate to Massachusetts' need to immediately now reduce the climate impacts of electricity consumption?
Meg, David's had his hand up for a bit.
David?
Yeah. I had one question.
Oh, you just muted yourself.
There we go. Yeah, it's what I'll call a frequently raised question because I keep hearing it all the time and I'd like to be able to answer it. How does one replace the what's considered hydropower from Quebec in the climate roadmaps that keep getting raised to cut greenhouse gases 85% by 2050? So how would one answer a frequently challenging question like that?
Anyone else want to answer that? I could take a stab at it.
I can try. David, this is Deb. David Hyman sits on the Sierra Club, Massachusetts Energy Committee. And David, if I understand, you're saying, how are we going to get the energy that we need if we don't include hydro? Is that your question?
Answer that thing.
Pardon?
Yeah, to be able to answer that.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is, local renewable energy, so wind and solar and storage. And, another piece, like one of the arguments for the, bringing this power in from Canada is the idea that, this gives us, energy from out of region that would kind of act like a battery. It's kind of a complicated issue, which I don't think has been brought up yet, which is the idea of grid stability and that when the wind doesn't blow, when the sun doesn't shine, how do you get power? And so, the way that we've been, one of the ways that Massachusetts has been sold this bill of goods is the idea that, well, this will bring in power when the wind isn't blowing or when the sun isn't shining. So I'm thinking that that's maybe where your question's coming from. And one way to address that is to actually create interties, like high voltage interties in between regions, so that the other regions of the country act like a battery, which does mean more transmission, but it doesn't mean transmission through unfragmented forest. It might mean transmission along existing right-of-ways already through current existing transmission corridors or roads or train right-of-ways. So there are ways to do it that don't involve environmental racism and terrible, horrible ecological land destruction, poor land management processes. So anyhow, it's kind of a complex question because of that idea of grid stability. But certainly there's plenty of wind and solar energy right here in our region between offshore wind and solar rooftops. And of course, if we're able to develop storage to the degree that we need, but also with interties into other regions, we should be able to get 100% renewable energy, with most of the energy generation coming right from the New England region with the associated benefits. And I'm not including biomass and burning wood in that assessment.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, Sarah, geothermal and wave energy also.
Heidi, I believe Heidi has a question.
Yes, I do. I first of all want to thank you for your continued uh, uh, forbearance, not fortitude in doing all of this work. I'm really grateful for everything. I hope I missed a little bit of the thing because I was busy sharing things out into Facebook land. But I wanted to bring up the concept of the pine tree amendment that's happening here in Maine. It's a very progressive amendment, LD 489, that would add it's the bill number 489 that would add language to the Maine Constitution to guarantee the right to a clean and healthy environment, including pure water, clean air, and healthy ecosystems, and to the preservation of the natural, cultural, recreational, scenic, and healthful qualities of the environment. There's a hearing on Monday. I think that this could be an excellent way for us all to at least help the situation here in Maine. If we pass this, this may be a way for us to have leverage. I don't know exactly yet. I haven't done enough of the research, but this is just something I have been learning about. But we're having a hearing at 10 a.m. on Monday, March 8th. I've put some links in the thing there about where it is. And if we could get support for that, I think that that would help. The other thing that I want to say is that I think that we also need to be talking about the fact that so many people are looking at the concept of losing jobs by transitioning into the new peaceful, clean, green energy economy. And I think that we need to be looking at what we can tell people. I'm working on a little bit of a document that I could help to share, but I think we need to be looking at how we can include all of those people that are saying that they're afraid of losing their jobs, to be able to reach out to them in a compassionate way that will help them to understand that we're talking about aggressive research and development into new clean green energy resources, and so that we're not just depending on the tried and true things that we've already discussed, and that we need to be looking at moonshots and looking at the things that we can be doing to really solve our energy things, because we don't want to see what happened in Texas happen anywhere else too. And I think that we need to be working on some of these issues. So I'm very grateful for all the work that you're doing, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Heidi. Interesting information. Appreciate your feedback. Catherine.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, all the speakers. That was excellent. I'm kind of wondering if or how I should say, this project in Maine and Massachusetts would or does affect Chippy coming into New York City. I'm in New York City. I'm chair of the New York City Sierra Club group. But of course, we're trying to stop it here, and both the mayor and the governor have come out publicly in favor of Chippy. So I'm wondering if we can help you nip it in the bud up there in Maine and Massachusetts, so to speak. Do you think that this would stop it in New York City as well? And how might we be able to help you more?
Anyone else want to take a stab at that?
I mean, I'll just say really quickly, I think, I just, I have to agree with Greg. Like, a lot of this is just about raising awareness of the fact that this isn't green. And the problem is that unfortunately, a lot of environmental advocates acted as if it was a green source of energy early on. And so we have to unlearn those learnings. and explain, you know, when you start saying you're working for environmental justice and for, you know, 30% preservation of all the land space in the world by 2030, you have to stop talking about mega dams, period. Like enough said. There's so many bad downsides to mega dams. It blows me away that people still, you know, still see it as a option. But you know, we also are hearing lots of, you know, what did we hear somewhere in Canada? They're talking about a methane gas being a bridge fuel still. I mean, you know, I just think similar to what I believe Cliff was saying, that, you know, these are just people that are trying to make money off of old dirty technologies where they, you know, where the profits are kept from the workers and really are just go to corporate management.
Thank you. I agree, raising awareness, sharing information. We have done a study to show that Hydro-Quebec does not have surplus energy, as they have been promising. They've kind of backed off that claim recently, but they do not have enough power to supply all 3 of the proposed corridors in Massachusetts, although it's kind of like a race to see who can get it built first. And hopefully they won't be building new dams, but if they do, that will certainly be for export. And we have a question from Sarah.
Actually, I would like to say a comment to Heidi in terms of how you convince people in transitioning to renewable energy and a greener lifestyle and environmental justice. I think one effective tool would be to look at the historical precedent, the civilian mobilization during World War II, and looking at how much we accomplished in 4 years in terms of getting American consumers to consume less, use alternative products, for instance, instead of leather, using shoes made out of cloth because the leather was rationed, consuming less meat because that was going to be shipped overseas for the soldiers, planting victory gardens, rationing gas. If we look at all of these things, for the most part, they were effective. And why not remind people, look what we did during World War II. We can do it again because we are facing a severe climate crisis. And that might get some people thinking that maybe this is feasible. And that could be a good way to reach out to average people, as Greg was talking about.
Absolutely. It needs to be part of the solution, all of the above. And there's no silver bullet when it comes to renewables. There's no renewable that doesn't have some negative impact, and all those ideas need to be part of the solution. Any other questions? Am I missing anyone?
Yes, you're missing Sarah.
Oh, I think that was just Sarah. Was that Sarah?
Still up.
I just want to say, gosh, I'm trying to remember what, Meg, what was the name of the woman who came with us to meet with CLF? The Indigenous woman from was it Roberta Flowers?
It was, I think it was Rita Manias.
No, I think
Amy Norman.
I thought it was Roberta Flowers.
Yeah.
It was Roberta Benefield from Grand
Roberta
Rapids.
Benefield, that was it.
Right.
She said the best thing ever when you know, people were trying to explain to her why we need mega dams. She said, "Why can't you people just learn to turn off your lights?"
Exactly. That's right.
And that has just struck with me like every day. It's absolutely true.
Very true. Very true. And you know what? I don't know what percent of Massachusetts total electricity consumption will come from those 1,200 megawatts from Hydro-Quebec, but I bet turning off lights and changing a few light bulbs would make a big difference and eliminate the need for that. And I really don't see that as the focus of what's in the Decarbonization Roadmap. And I think that's really, you know, where we need to be, along with all these other ideas about reducing consumption and so forth. Anyone else I'm missing? Questions? Regina. I am seeing Catherine on Regina's screen. Okay. Any more questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up. Can I do that?
Oh, sure. Hi, Heidi. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I wanted to let you know that I actually rode down to the Forward on Climate rally bus, the Sierra Club bus with Becky Bartovix, with Ezra Silk, and he founded this amazing group called the Climate Mobilization, and it's exactly what Deb was talking about. So I've been well aware of this for quite some time, and that rally for Forward on Climate rally was in 2013. So it's a really great organization, and they're doing really great things.
Great, thank you. Anyone else?
Quick, short questions, if I may, Meg.
Sure.
Okay. Of Kevin, I was very excited to hear about the injunction against cutting down the forests. And I would like to hear if he thinks that that could turn into something more permanent. And the other quick question is, are there a lot of Canadians pushing against the hydro dams? But I'm most interested in Kevin's question about the injunction, because that was very good news.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Catherine.
You're welcome.
It's hard to say. You know, I don't like to make predictions. There's a lot of steps in the process. If we succeed at the Court of Appeals, that's the first step to get the case back down to the district court to have the district court look at the merits of the case. And then if we are successful on the merits, then typically in a NEPA case, that's what this is, National Environmental Policy Act. It's a procedural statute that requires the government to take a hard look at the impacts. So typically, what happens is the district court remands back to the agencies, either the Corps or DOE, to do some more work and perhaps do an EIS, which would take some additional time. But in turn, that could have an impact on the injunction. But right now, we're just taking it one step at a time, and we'll see what happens.
Thank you.
And just on your comments on the pushback in Canada, and unfortunately there's even a divide, it seems, amongst the environmental community, and it's going to be difficult and challenging really to get the public on side. Now, I think that said, everything that's happened in Muskrat Falls, so the 4-year delay, the $6 billion of over budget isn't sitting well with obviously many residents of Newfoundland and Labrador. But on the flip side, people in Nova Scotia, I don't think really see that as perhaps as big of an issue, because they already signed the contract. We are not paying an extra penny for that electricity. So I think there's maybe less of a concern in certain jurisdictions and more of a concern in others. But yeah, it'll be challenging.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you.
On that note, as Greg mentioned, the Muskrat Falls project was phase 1 of the dam, the 2-part upper Lower Churchill project on the Grand River, the Mistachipu in Labrador. I'm probably not saying that correctly. I apologize. That dam has been talked about. We do have a petition that's going to be coming out, and we'll be circulating that around to try to stop the Gull Island Dam. It's a campaign that NAMRA is working on with our allies in Nova Scotia, with the Sierra Club Foundation and the Sierra Club in Maine and other states. So keep your eye out for that, and please sign on to help us stop that new dam. Okay, so take action. Contact Governor Baker, contact ISO New England, sign our Gull Island petition when it comes out, and stay strong and healthy, everyone. We need all the eco warriors we can muster for this battle that we're in for the planet. And it's great to be connected with everyone, and thank you for your attention. Anyone else have any final words that they'd like to provide?
Thanks a lot, Meg.
All right, thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks, folks. Have a good